Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of Resistance with the Butterfly Princess and Jennifer Boyer. Today, it's going to be a shorter episode today. I'm not going to ask questions. Instead, I'm just going to let Jennifer talk about rescuers' resistance and the information that she has. So I'm now gonna pass you on to Jennifer and just say hi, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us again for episode 3 of this 5-part series.
Hello, it's so good to be back. I'm happy to be here talking about rescue as resistance because this is kind of my thing.
Yeah.
This is a really exciting episode for me.
So I'll let you get started. Yeah.
Okay. All right. It's interesting because we're going to end up focusing a lot today on women and the feminine. And that's not to exclude men, but what we see with resistance is that the men did the bulk of the fighting resistance while the women did the most of the nonviolent, and most of the nonviolent stuff was somehow connected to rescue. And while at first many humanitarian groups especially were trying to save all Jewish people, it got to a point where that just wasn't practical anymore. And people began to think, well, if we can't save the adults, we can at least save the children. And so today we're going to talk a lot about women, and not that men didn't help rescue. They absolutely did. We just see, like when I was doing research for my dissertation, I found that 69.6% of French people who were named Righteous Among the Nations, which is the award that the Yad Vashem in Israel gives out to non-Jewish people who risk their lives to save Jewish people during the Holocaust. So 69.6%, so roughly 70% of French were women. And this comes from a really respected source, Renee Poznansky, who is one of the leading scholars on France and the Holocaust. Like in France alone, it's estimated they saved like 7,500 to 9,000 children. And I'm using France because I have this data here. When I began to kind of research a little more for this episode, and I wanted to see a breakdown of gender, the Yad Vashem doesn't do that. And so it's up to researchers to go through the list of names. And I am like all in, but to go through like 7,000 names and divide it to male and female, that was a lot. So I just wanted to just kind of make those points before I really dig in here. And I know we've talked about this in our other show that we did on the Holocaust in general. And I'm pretty sure I've mentioned it in this as well. But more women resisted in humanitarian and nonviolent ways because it was easier for them. And historians talk about women having what they call a natural disguise. And that natural disguise is just the fact that they're women. Because of so many, and you remember, we're dealing with the late 1930s to mid 1940s. We've got a very kind of sexist society, set up in Western culture. And so women tended to get involved, young single women tended to get involved because it was easier, because Germans and even the French militia who supported the Nazis looked at women as dumb, vain, frivolous, like they couldn't hold a thought in their head. All they're good for is looking pretty and making babies. And so those sexist attitudes contributed to that natural disguise and made things easier for women. And I know I've mentioned before that in the East, there's even one more piece that makes things more complicated, and that is language. Because in Poland, where the concentration of Jewish people was, um, people spoke Hebrew, Yiddish, and Polish in those areas. Now, the Jewish people were the only ones speaking Hebrew and Yiddish. And because male children were sent to yeshiva school, and they learned Hebrew and they learned about the Torah, they never got a common education and never learned the common tongue of Polish, but the women did. And so women could speak Polish without an accent. And one of the ways, we're going to talk about three different ways that people kind of survived, and how rescue plays a role with these things. One of the things was passing. Jewish people who didn't look Jewish, and who were more Aryan looking, and could speak Polish fluently without accent, could pass then as a Polish person, as their false ID would have said. So, and it's so interesting with these alternate identities that they become, these other people. It A lot of women have said it has helped them to have this sort of alter ego. It made them braver. It made them, because like it wasn't like, it wasn't Jennifer doing it. It was, if my name was like Bruiser or something, I don't know, something tough or something, strong sounding, or, and sometimes you got to pick your name, but a lot of times, um, yeah, it was a matter of what IDs they could get of real people who had real baptism records and birth records and stuff, like when things would be bombed. And if records were bombed, people would go in, the resistance in each country could go in and they would try and steal as many of those records as possible to use them to help people pass and get those false IDs that made sense. And if the Nazis decided to go look and see if there was someone named Jennifer Boyer who was born in Silver Spring, Maryland, that's where they're going to find those records and they'll be there. So it was really kind of the tricks that they learned along the way and the way that they learned to survive contributed to that natural disguise of being someone else. But even women who were not Jewish had that natural disguise, simply because they were women. And so we see a lot of women out there who play up these roles. And I know we've talked about the movie Black Book before, which is an excellent film on the Dutch resistance, and a woman who kind of does that, pretending, almost like an actor would do. But instead of someone yelling cut at the end of the scene, these are real people whose real lives are at stake, so it's all, I'm surprised, honestly, there aren't more movies made, because it is just so like almost sensational and unbelievable, some of the stories, that are out there. And so, sorry, as we talked about, that was passing. The other way would be hiding. And this is really, really where outsiders played a humongous role. Because in terms of hiding, you had to have someone who was willing to hide you and not sell you out. And so the people who were involved, oftentimes it began with humanitarian resistance. They would recruit people that they knew they could trust. Usually they were not Jewish. And we're going to talk in a little bit about the Catholic Church. But sometimes it was a matter of going to churches. And because the Catholic Church dominates, European religion, the Catholic Church really played a huge role both in the annihilation of the Jews, but also in terms of the rescue of the Jews. They have a very complicated role during the Holocaust that we'll talk about. So what I want to do is talk a little bit more about the hiding part. One of the people I wanted to highlight is a woman named Irina Sendler. Um, there's an excellent, excellent book by Tyler Mazzeo, and it's called Irina's Children, and I would highly recommend it. It even if you're not a big history person and don't want to read like kind of dry historical texts, this she tells a story in here, and she does a really nice job. It reads more like a novel than it does, like a purely nonfiction, even though the whole thing is nonfiction. But Irina was from Poland, and she was a social worker who became involved in Żegota. And Żegota was the Polish Welfare Council that, when we talked about humanitarian resistance, we talked about how oftentimes, it was humanitarian their contributions that ultimately turned into resistance through rescue. And that's exactly what happened with Żegota. And so what was so helpful about this was that by being part of Żegota, the Social Welfare Council, the above the board, she was able to get into the Warsaw Ghetto. And this is where the majority of her clandestine work took place. And she smuggled Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. There's one story in here, and she works with a Jewish nurse who is in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they're able to work with some doctors. They get there was a baby, and it took a long time to convince this mother to give up her baby. They had someone already lined up to take care of the child, who would raise it as their own should anything happen to the mother. Everything was set and safe. But as a parent, you can imagine how difficult it is to let your child go. And so they finally convinced this mother, but because it was a baby, and we don't know when babies are going to just start wailing, right? They needed to safely put the baby to sleep with medication. And, that was a risk in and of itself, because they were in the Warsaw Ghetto, not in some hospital with, monitors and everything. And so it was really the work of doctors and nurses, both who were part of the resistance and also who were inside the Warsaw Ghetto. They were it was so important, so important. And that was just one of the harrowing stories, of, and Tyler Mazzeo, of course, does such a much better job in with all the details. It's estimated that Irina Sendler saved 2,500 children. Um, and like, let that number sink in. And although I know it's really tempting, even for me to say she did this, I think it's really important that we have to remember people don't rescue these children alone. She needed those doctors and nurses and the people who were going to take in the child, and the Catholic Church to give the child a baptism certificate. Like, there were a lot of pieces in motion and that's just for one baby, right? So think about all of the children and all of the different, cogs that have to be working in time, or else the whole thing falls apart. And this risk was real. It was a great risk. Had she been caught, had any one of them been caught, that's it. Especially the Jewish people would have been killed on the spot. She would have been tortured, and they would have tried to extract information from her, which eventually they did. She was captured and jailed, and she was brutally beaten and tortured. But she never gave anything away. And that was one of the other interesting pieces that I learned as I was researching the women who helped. And that is that overall, women withstand torture better than men do, that women were less likely to kind of, rat out their fellow resistance, colleagues, than men. And one of the women theorized it's because women deal with pain of menstruation and childbirth, so we kind of have a higher pain threshold than men do. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but the men in my life, when they get sick, they are total babies. So
Yes, of course.
So, so this was just Irina Sendler alone in Poland. And so the other thing I want to talk about, because we're talking about how it takes more than just one person, I want to feature now an entire village in France known as Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. And for any Timothy Chalamet fans out there, this is where his grandfather was born. And I can't remember if his dad was born there or not, but there is registered a pastor who was involved in the hiding of Jews in Le Chambon, whose last name was Chalamet. I have not been able to verify if it was his grandfather or not, but and I don't know how common that last name was in the Chambon. But I just thought that, that's I love finding out links between celebrities and some of these things. I think I know that not that long ago, um, I, I don't keep up with celebrity gossip, but I don't know if Timothy is still dating one of the Jenner girls or not, but I know a couple summers ago he took her to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, and showed her around, which I found really interesting. And I couldn't help but wonder, what stories is he telling her? Is he telling her what happened, during World War II? Um, because the story is really remarkable. And if you can get your hands on a documentary, um, and oh shoot, give me a minute to think about what it's called, but it's made by a man who was the first child born in Le Chambon to a Jewish family that was being hidden there. Here, I'm just going to grab my notes on it so I can, Weapons of the Spirit. And Pierre Sauvage is the gentleman who made the documentary, and it tells the story of Le Chambon, and it has interviews with people, and it kind of has a reunion at the end of some of especially the children who were saved in Le Chambon. So again, there's another resource for viewers to check out. And I can type this all to you as well. But this kind of all came together under the guidance of a man named André Trocmé. And André Trocmé was a Huguenot pastor, so a Protestant pastor. And he and his wife, Magda, were really they were really distraught by what was happening. And Le Chambon, they have a history of helping people who are being persecuted. In fact, Le Chambon, like the whole the plateau in France where this is, the Vivarais-Lignon plateau, which is comprised of several villages, that area was founded during the French Wars of Religion, when the Catholics and Huguenots were murdering one another all the time. But the Catholics far outnumbered the Huguenots. So this group kind of went and escaped because the plateau is in an area where there is extreme weather, and it's between mountains, and so it's very difficult to get to. It's very the weather is it can be a huge impediment to getting there. I took a train one time from Paris down to the southern coast, and we I was like, where am I at? That it was sunny, and now I'm almost at the Mediterranean, but like it felt like a Dementor was going to get on board the train. Like everything outside got cold and cloudy, and there was fog, and like it was I joked with my friend that I was expecting a Dementor, and did she have her wand ready? So it is definitely and during the Holocaust, when they were hiding, these Jewish people, that weather was a huge friend to them because it really kept the Nazis away for the most part. Um, but they in his one of his well, I shouldn't say one, but in several of his sermons, he preached to his people that Christ commands us to love one another. It doesn't say love only Aryan people, love only, these kinds of people. It's love everyone. And in order to do that, as good Christians, we need to help these people who are being persecuted. And so the village comes together. And I think this is important because we get so focused, I think, on individuals as our heroes, right? Um, but so often it's about a community of people who helped. It's very rare that one singular person rescues someone else completely by themselves and alone. So that's just really important. Remember, for every hero that we celebrate, there were a dozen more helping them. And that's kind of how it was in Le Chambon. But the Chambon itself, the population was 5,000. And it's believed that they saved about 5,000 people, and about 3,500 of those were Jewish. So it was really, really a remarkable place. And I should have brought the book over from my bookshelf, but another book someone could read if they wanted to learn more about Le Chambon is called The Plateau. Very simple, The Plateau, and it's by Maggie Paxton. And she is just a lovely human being, and her book is so beautifully written, with so much, great information. She tells, again, a lovely story about a really special individual within the Trocmé family that she ultimately finds out she's related to. So there's like this whole full circle thing that's really neat about it. Um, so so we've got Maggie Paxson and The Plateau. We have Irina's Children by Tyler Mazzeo. Both those are the two books I've mentioned so far, as well as the documentary Weapons of the Spirit, directed and made by Pierre Sauvage. Okay. So those are our hiding examples, whether it is individuals hiding, other children, or if it is an entire community bringing in people. And this is now where I want to focus a little more on the Roman Catholic Church, because, like I said, I saw an interview with a Holocaust survivor one time, and she said the priest in your village held his very life in your hands. He decided what happened to all the Jews in that particular village. Because if the priest said they're evil, round them up, then that's what happened. But if they didn't, people didn't quite know how to act. And usually these priests were the ones who were helping to hide Jewish children in particular. Children were easier. In some senses, because it's easier to hide their identity. And so these little Jewish children would go to whatever convent or monastery that was, given to them as a safe place. And one of the biggest helpers in all of France was a bishop, and he
Well, I'll be shortly.
is everything okay?
Yeah, I just need to be done in about 10 minutes, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm pretty much through a lot of the things,
yeah,
so I just have to do leaving and then we'll be
yeah,
good. Um,
yeah.
so okay. So the Catholic Church was Bishop Saliage was in the south of France, and he worked with several other priests and nuns. They would bring these children, but the thing is, especially if the children were of from like 6 up, in the Catholic Church, usually when you're about 7 years old, second grade, is when you make your first Holy Communion. And so by then they would have had a certain amount of Catholic education. And so Jewish children would not only have to learn a completely new identity, um, they would also have to learn a completely new religion, because the Nazis and the militia would not, and this goes for all the countries, they were not above asking a child to recite the Lord's Prayer or to recite the Hail Mary or ask them when they were last at confession, or, they understood that this was happening. And so they would try and catch these children, children. Because like they're like the enemies of the state, right? And so this was wonderful. The problem post-war was that a lot of Jewish children lost their Jewishness. They lost that ethnic piece, that cultural piece. And so this was a even bigger problem when you consider that the majority of parents did not come back.
Mm,
Um, and so it was a matter of trying to track down family, and if not, then it was usually raised in a Catholic orphanage at that point. So although there was a big movement to move these children to Israel once Israel was established. So then the last way of rescuing was leaving, taking the children completely out of whatever country that they were in, into a safer place. Um, Safer places were difficult to find, but because Switzerland was a neutral state, as was Spain and Portugal, those were the places most often utilized, as was Casablanca, to a certain extent. And so the person I'm kind of highlighting in terms of a leaving story, it is definite heroism and bravery, but it's also absolutely tragic. And I think, you know, everyone else I've talked about survived this. The woman I'm about to talk about did not. And her name was Mary Ann Cohn. She was originally born in Germany, and when Hitler came to power and things began to get, pretty awful for Jewish people, she and her family moved to France, and she became involved in the EIF, which was the Jewish Scouts in France, like the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. And a lot of young people learned how to survive in the woods and so forth through scouting groups. Scouting actually played a huge role. I could do a whole episode on how like their version of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts rescued so many people. But she ended up joining the Jewish resistance, one of the Jewish resistance groups. And she was hired to basically smuggle people into Spain, or Switzerland. And, this was dangerous for everyone. It was known that sometimes smugglers would sell out the Jewish people they were smuggling. And, so everyone was at risk. But Marianne, in July of 1944, she was taking 28 children, with a couple other people, from France into Switzerland, and she was right on the Swiss border in a town in France called Annemasse. And she was captured. The children and she were all like held on. They were contained, her in jail. They tortured Marianne to try and get names, and, that was a very common thing. She didn't give anything away. And the French resistance came to her at night and said, "Hey, we have a way to get you out. We're going to come and rescue you." And she said, "No, because if you do, they, you know, the Germans were known for their reprisal killings, and she said, if you let me go, they will murder all the children. I have to stay," even though she knew that meant she was going to die. And I think, wow, like that's like really amazing. Um, but in her short lifetime, she saved over 1,600 children by leading them out, of France, and a lot of them had come through to from other countries as well. And so I just wanted to. She wrote a poem when she was in prison in Nice. This was from a little bit of an earlier time, but it's kind of haunting when you think about what ultimately happens to her, like not even a year later. The poem's called I Shall Betray Tomorrow. Tomorrow I will betray, not today. Tear out my nails today. I will not betray. You don't know how long I can hold out, but I know. You are 5 tough hands with rings. You have hobnailed boots on your feet. Today, I have nothing to say. Tomorrow, I will betray. So that's like, I think it's really powerful when you
Yeah.
consider, yeah. Uh,
Mm.
you know, and she, the woman she had taken place of, her name was Mila Racine. Mila Racine died the same way. So those who were the guides heading out, they were in peril constantly. And it didn't have a happy ending for everyone. But just to kind of close everything and wrap it all up in terms of, rescue through hiding, passing, and leaving. Um, just that concept of rescue is so important. And we have to remember the people who risk their lives. And Elie Wiesel, who is probably the most well-known Holocaust survivor, he has a quote, and I really like it. And it's usually how I end my lectures on rescue as resistance. He says, "Let us not forget, after all, that there is always a moment when the moral choice is made. Often because of one story or one book or one person, we are able to make a different choice, a choice for humanity, for life. And so we must know these good people who helped Jews during the Holocaust. We must learn from them, and in gratitude and hope, we must remember them." And I hope all my fellow Americans remember that as well.
Thank you, and thank you, and we'll look forward to hearing the next episode on art as a form of resistance. And
Absolutely.
like I say, I look forward to doing other series, collaborating on other series in the near future as well.
Absolutely. I'm very excited for it.
Yeah, I'm really sorry that we've had to rush through today's episode. It's just had to be somewhere, and next time we should still be all right on a Friday or whatever, or any other day, of course. So my apologies for that.
Oh, please don't worry at
Yeah,
all. It's not a big deal. I got
yeah.
through everything, no problem.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you anyway, and I'll see you next time. I'll email you through with a day, and we can take it from there.
Okay, that sounds really good. Have you stopped recording?
Yeah, I'll turn the thing off now.